You probably know I'm dead against Shell Recharge for such a variety of reasons, and I've always bundled BP Pulse in with them. But has BP Pulse broken away and become a good guy? Is the writing on the wall saying loud and clear that oil is on its way out, and has Shell not yet spotted it? Well, BP Pulse has made a series of dramatic bold moves and issued a catastrophic statement about where they see things heading. Well, first, let's get real. These are huge multi-billion-dollar oil companies, so any expectation of an instant shift away from oil is not going to happen. Certainly not voluntary. For over 100 years, they've ruled the world, and they're not giving that up now. They have invested billions in exploration and extraction, and that investment is still out there producing petrol, diesel and gas. They will not write that off easily. But even a total idiot can see things are changing. EVs were once laughed at, now they're taken very seriously. They are not going away. In fact, their growth is accelerating almost exponentially. And we've all seen exponential growth in action recently. At first, just little changes, then a bit more, and suddenly it seems it almost leaps out of control. And the world is changing. Who would have thought just 2 years ago that Russia would do what it has done? Russia was one of the top 3 exporters of oil in the world, along with Saudi Arabia and the USA. But that stopped rather instantly, and the Western world was thrown into chaos from which it is still recovering. In a world already seriously concerned about climate change and air pollution, which are both still accelerating, a shortage of oil and gas made Europe sit up and take notice. Germany in particular had long cozied up to Russia, possibly just to help the relationship, possibly in the hope Russia would westernise, but mainly I think because the oil and its refined products were cheap. Only suddenly they weren't cheap, they weren't there. Imports of oil and oil-based refined products from Russia into Germany have now just about ceased in just over a year. And Russian gas is no longer being imported at all. Well, this has sent Europe into a crisis, trying to replace their energy supplies. And across the Atlantic in 2020, in an absolutely massive coincidence, Tesla launched the world's first grid-connected megapack. Suddenly, the biggest failures of renewable energy disappeared. PV doesn't work at night, wind doesn't always blow, there are huge peaks where massive amounts of electricity are being produced and lost because nobody's using it, and there are times when there's not enough renewable energy to go round. Well, countries also for the first time started talking about energy security, being in control of their own energy, not being at the mercy and whim of a mad dictator or a money-hungry sheik on the other side of the world. At exactly the same time, the sale of EVs really took off and quickly became the top-selling cars in the world, threatening on their own the very future of fossil fuel cars. Well, the world has already moved on rather dramatically and exceedingly quickly, and companies like Shell and BP have had all their previous business plans torn up. Nothing is the same. But while Shell seems to be battling on business as usual, got years yet, nothing to worry about, BP seems to read the same data very differently. Almost all major countries have now passed into law the end of the sale of new fossil fuel cars, ranging from 2030 to 2035. That first ban could be less than 7 years from now, and it will happen. In the US, California, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon and Washington have all made legal commitments to stop allowing sales of new fossil fuel-powered cars by 2035, and they are actively funding their replacement with direct subsidies to EV buyers and factories producing EVs, batteries and battery components. And we know this is serious because European and UK car manufacturers have all complained to the WTO that this is like a US monopoly and they will miss out. Many countries also directly subsidise PV, wind and grid battery storage. Even in the USA, a massively oil-based economy. Well, here in the UK, we still subsidise oil exploration and offer virtually no financial incentive to EV owners wanting to make the change. Unlike the $7,500 offered in the US, around €7,000 in Germany, and Norway offers around 25% off in the form of no purchase tax, no road tax, and free tolls and ferries. Come on UK, catch up. Just use the oil company's subsidies to promote EVs and chargers. Well, BP in the 2022 Energy Outlook never seriously mentioned PV or wind or battery storage, apart from a passing, well, maybe someday. But the recently published 2023 Energy Outlook is totally different, night and day. It's filled with graphs and charts, figures, data, all of which very clearly show that fossil fuels like petrol and diesel are finished. Now, I don't mean tomorrow. New petrol and diesel cars will be sold for the next 7 years, probably in increasing numbers as the manufacturers realise the ban is really going to happen and they try to get rid of all of their stock by heavy discounting before they're banned from selling them and being stuck with thousands or hundreds of thousands of worthless cars. Even after that date, any existing ICE cars on the road can continue to be used, can be driven, can be bought and sold. It's just there'll be no new ones. If you sell no new ones, and the average life of a car is 12 to 14 years, slowly, all existing cars will reach the end of their lives and end up in a scrap heap. If no new ones are sold and the old ones wear out, there must come a day, probably 2040, 2045, when there are almost none left except for a tiny percentage who will hang on for grim death. Even the BP report, prepared by a major oil company, states that there are unlikely to be very many fossil fuel-powered cars left on the road in Europe, UK and USA by 2040. Nor is the gas business safe and facing a glowing future. The UK has already banned the sale of new gas boilers after 2025. It's 2 years from now. New York has set 2026 and California has passed a law that bans gas boilers by 2030. Gas boilers have a similar lifespan to cars, maybe 10 to 15 years of useful life. Increasingly, new builds will be built with either heat pumps or, much more likely, some other cheaper form of electric heating. In fact, in a massive money-saving exercise, many new homes are being built in the southeast with no gas supply at all. And heating is provided by slapping in a few electric panels. Well, slowly the old gas boilers will wear out, cannot be replaced with new gas boilers. By 2045, 2050, if the bans are enforced, there will hardly be any gas boilers left running. By 2050, less than 27 years from now, the Western world will have moved on from oil and gas into renewably generated and battery-stored electricity. Clean, green, non-polluting. The writing is well and truly on the wall for all to see, except those that cling, for whatever reason, to lethal polluting petrol cars or inefficient gas boilers who just deny everything. Now, if you're enjoying this video and want to see more, please subscribe so you will be notified when we release a new one. And please consider joining as a Patreon member to support the channel financially. So, from our opening statement, what has BP Pulse done and what have they said? Well, they've just installed 2 giant EV charging hubs, one in London, one in Kettering, with a third one planned for Westminster later this year. The Kettering hub has 10 300 kilowatt dual port chargers, and they allow 10 cars to charge at 300 kilowatt or 20 at 150. And the London one has 23 300 kilowatt dual chargers. These are huge, and there are facilities. Maybe not brilliant, but they're there. Now here is the shock. BP states, not me, BP, these are aimed squarely at taxis and car hire firms and rideshare companies. This report predicts that by 2025, just 18 months from now, 80% of all public charging in London will be for taxis, private hire and ride-sharing vehicles. Uber is the first fleet customer to have dedicated chargers for its drivers. The same is happening in the US. You can no longer register and use a petrol or diesel taxi in New York or California. They must now all be electric. Now, this change is huge, and it's not me guessing. It's the oil company telling us all this. And just as huge is the loss of the fossil fuel the industry used to supply them. A typical taxi does more than 45,000 miles a year and has pretty terrible efficiency, all stop-start, doing less than 30 miles to the gallon. Well, is BP just greenwashing? And I really don't think so. I think it's just like a drug addict who wakes up one day and he really, really doesn't want to stop, but realising that continuing will kill them. BP desperately wants things to keep going the way they always have, but seems to accept that this is no longer an option. They have to act, no matter how painful the change will be. You see, it gets even worse. Elon Musk has stated that Tesla battery packs and drivetrains should be good for the life of the car. He estimates 18 to 20 years, or 500,000 miles. They last longer than ICE cars. Already there are used Teslas on the market, but they are still ridiculously expensive today. But in another 2 or 3 years, they will be dropping down into the 10 to 20,000 used car market in sensible numbers. And the Chinese are coming. They've just entered a massive domestic slump with production of EVs far outstripping demand, maybe 20 million cars a year, more than they can sell locally. What will they do with them? Well, already the MG4 EV is here, a bargain at 27,000, a really nice car. Then BYD and NIO have just arrived, and many more will follow. And they will get cheaper. Oh, here's a thought. The average price of a used car in the UK is currently around £17,000, according to RAC figures. What will happen when you can buy a brand new, reasonably spec'd EV for under 20,000? Who in their right mind will buy a used petrol car with 30 to 40,000 miles when they can buy a brand new EV for less, which is much cheaper to run, requires no servicing, can drive in congestion and ULEZ zones free, and has a 4-year warranty on the car and 8 years on the battery and drivetrain? I think BP Pulse has seen all this, and probably in far greater detail than I have, and worked out that in less than 10 years, the petrol car will already be terminally doomed. The sale of petrol and diesel will collapse very shortly afterwards. Yeah, there will always be some people driving around in ICE cars for decades. They already do. There are some beautiful classics on the road today. But long before the 2030 ban on new ICE car sales comes into force, the ICE car will already be heading rapidly non-stop to extinction. Now, BP Pulse, as I said, I believe they've seen all this and decided to get in now. They have nothing to lose. They must have this desperate, last gasp hope that there is a reversal. No bans, none of this really happens, EVs simply stop selling, and then they can always go back to, well, what is the alternative? Where do they go? The congestion zones and ULEZs are there to stop people from dying. Even if EVs fail to catch on, the days of the internal combustion engine running on fossil fuels are severely numbered. Now that's another video. My own thought is that they will not just go quietly, not just accept the closing down of their business empires, the capping of the oil wells in Saudi Arabia and Texas. They could go totally renewable, but that would be to write off all of their existing infrastructure. The oil wells, the rigs, the refineries, worth billions, or at least they cost billions. Now please check out my other video in this series looking at whether hydrogen vehicles could overtake EVs. You see, you can make hydrogen completely clean and green from PV, wind, tidal, but you can also make hydrogen from gas. And they will have loads of it going cheap. Natural gas is methane, chemical symbol is CH4. That's 4 hydrogens per carbon. Loads of hydrogen. Could this be a brand new industry using all their existing infrastructure? Maybe they can rule the world once again. Well, what's the next in the series? EV charging versus hydrogen. Who will win? Well, thanks for watching to the end. I do believe BP has changed, definitely not out of choice, but reluctantly and inevitably hedging their bets, exploring all other possible angles that allow them to continue producing oil or gas, dipping their toes into a clean, green, renewable future if that fails, running out of options rapidly. So I see BP going renewable as a contingency plan. If it's going to happen, they may as well make a profit from it, even if it wasn't in their business plan last year. I'm Dave.